The Bundle in the Forest. Randy the reindeer, Maggie the magpie, and Harriet the horse sat in a small clearing in the forest. There were butterflies flying around them cheerfully as they watched the sunrise. Randy stared out at the wonderful horizon, taking in the beautiful hues of orange, yellow, and purple. It was almost as if an artist had used the sky as his canvas. The woods were silent. The only noise in the forest was the pitter-patter of the animals' feet as they plodded through the trees. As Randy the reindeer followed his friends through the forest, he heard a quiet sniffle, which seemed to slowly increase as much as he tried to ignore it. Maggie was the second one to notice the distant cry. All of the animals stopped in their tracks. Harriet trotted over to where the noise was coming from. All of the animals waited in anticipation. "Come quick!" she cried. The panic in her voice was prominent. The rest of the animals sprinted to her aid as quickly as they could. The sound of feet on the floor echoed throughout the forest. The woodland animals took an instant interest in the tiny, frail baby who was in front of them. She was so small, they decided to call her Jasmine. Randy gasped. She shouldn't be out in the forest at this time of night. It was dangerous, and not to mention freezing cold. They had to get her home to her parents. Leaving Jasmine out in the forest would be madness. Harriet walked over to the tiny baby and brushed her soft nose against the child's cheek tenderly. "What do we do?" Maggie asked. She was circling the child, noting her every breath and movement as if she was her child. She had wonderful green eyes, like the different colors one might find in a vibrant garden, and long bushy eyelashes. She was absolutely beautiful. Randy helped push Jasmine onto Harriet's back, while Maggie sat on Harriet's neck, watching over the newborn carefully. Then the animals started to head towards the closest village they could think of. It was a quaint collection of homes which was right beside a gorgeous field. It was a dark morning, and Harriet was struggling to see. It had rained heavily the previous night, and they could only hope that Jasmine hadn't been out since then. She had to stop walking when they came across a river. It was flooded. How on earth were they going to get around it? "What do we do now?" asked Harriet, looking around the forest desperately. They needed to find some way to get Jasmine home before it got dark again. "We need to build a bridge," answered Randy. "That should work." And then Maggie flew off to start collecting some twigs and branches from the trees. Harriet joined her and started picking up some rocks and other debris in her massive mouth. Randy stood watch and made sure Jasmine stayed comfortably on Harriet's back while his best friends looked for materials. She was so small and delicate. It was a worry that she would fall and injure herself. They had to be careful. Soon, Maggie and Harriet returned, holding a crazy amount of branches in their mouths. They placed them over the river so Harriet and Jasmine could cross safely. Every step Harriet took was crucial. If she even missed one branch, they could fall into the lake. That would cause all types of problems. Once they had all crossed the icy river safely, they carried on their journey to take Jasmine home to her parents. They passed a group of stunning evergreen trees and a beautiful lake which was slightly frozen. As the sun came up slowly, it reflected beautifully on the iced lake. The group of woodland animals came across some logs they had to cross. This journey was becoming harder and harder. In order to get Jasmine across safely, they had to avoid jumping like they normally would. Randy thought about all the times in summer when he and Harriet would race over this part of the forest, and Maggie would fly above, watching for who would win. "What do we do now?" asked Harriet. She sounded rather hopeless as she walked up and down the length of the logs, trying to find a gap that she could squeeze Jasmine through safely. Finally, they came to a realization. Maggie lifted Jasmine by her pretty pink blanket into the air and carried her safely over the pile of rotting logs. She stirred slightly as she was hoisted into the air. She must have fallen asleep while they were plodding through the woods. The group carried on marching towards the village when they came across another problem. Harriet was starting to get tired of carrying the newborn baby on her back. Her neck had sagged slightly, and her legs must have been aching a great amount. She was breathing super heavily. Maggie and Randy had started to get worried. Randy marched towards Harriet and stood next to her, watching the small newborn wiggle and cry as Maggie once again lifted her off Harriet's back. Maggie lifted Jasmine up and put her carefully onto Randy's massive back, rewrapping the blanket around her delicate body. "Finally," Harriet said, taking a small breath, "I can relax for a while." The other animals giggled at Harriet's obvious relief. She deserved to rest for a little while. As Randy carried the baby on his back, they came across a large hole in the ground. Maggie was too tired to carry the newborn across again, but she might still be able to help. "We need to make sure she doesn't fall down the hole. We can't return her to her parents all dirty." Maggie fluttered down into the hole. Hopefully, if little Jasmine fell, then she would be able to catch her and stop her from getting muddy. Harriet wormed her way to the other side of the hole in the mud. Randy started to move across the large hole, but his hoof slipped. He let out a loud yelp as Jasmine slipped off his back. Maggie tried to catch her, but she was very heavy. Harriet ran over to the hole and watched as Maggie lifted her out slowly. She was okay, but she was very muddy. They couldn't leave her dirty. They would have to travel to the hot springs. It would add a little bit of time onto their journey, but they couldn't bring her back to her parents if she was covered in mud. So Maggie lifted Jasmine from the muddy hole and put her onto Randy's back, and they set off for the hot springs. By the time they got there, the sun was high in the sky. It was time for lunch. The hot springs were a pleasant contrast to the freezing cold air that had surrounded them for hours. They slowly unwrapped Jasmine and saw her adorable clothes. Luckily, the mud had only coated the blanket and a bit of her thin hair. As Maggie lowered her into a small puddle of warm water, Randy and Harriet helped slowly splash some water onto her head. She was clean again. Once Jasmine was clean, they made their way back to the forest and towards the village, where they hoped to find Jasmine's parents. The animals carried on trotting through the forest quickly. They had to get Jasmine home soon. Her parents must be worried. They were nearing the village when they came across a man in the woods. His hair was messy, and his clothes were rather ragtag. Maybe he was homeless. The man told them that the road to the town had been blocked by a herd of loose sheep. They would have to find a way through the group of animals or find another route. But it was far too late to go back over the river or past the pile of logs again. They wouldn't get to the town by nighttime, and they didn't want to risk putting the baby through another night. It would only get colder, and Jasmine's parents must be extremely worried now. They needed to get Jasmine home. All they could do was hope that the sheep would understand and move out of their way. This was becoming the hardest journey in the world, and they were all starting to get very tired. When they finally arrived at the blocked road, the sheep were moving around frantically. How were they going to get through them? "What do we do now?" asked Harriet with a weighty sigh. She was especially tired after carrying Jasmine most of the way. "Maybe we could ask them to move," said Maggie. She sounded rather tired too. Randy walked up to the sheep at the front and started trying to herd them away from Jasmine. They had to keep her safe. That was their main priority. Maggie flew overhead, trying her hardest to attract their attention and get them to move out of the road so they could pass through. Harriet went to help and tried her hardest to push the sheep back into their fields. Slowly, it started to work, and the sheep began to move out of the way. Hopefully, this would all be worth it when they worked out how to get Jasmine home to her anxious parents. By the time the forest animals had managed to move the sheep out of the way, the sun had started to set on the horizon. The hot rays fell delicately on their skin as they walked towards the village. It was getting late. They hoped that they had chosen the right village. As they stepped on the homey cobbled paths, they realized that everyone would be in their houses by now. The sun was going down, and everyone would be getting ready for bed. The idea of sleeping was making the poor animals more and more sleepy themselves. They started to knock on the doors, kicking the oak with their hooves. But whenever people would open the door, they would shake their heads at the animals. They started to wonder if they would ever find Jasmine's parents. Suddenly, a man and a woman came running over to the animals. They grabbed Jasmine and sniveled into her stunning, clean, pink blanket. "Thank you," the woman cried as she wrapped her arms around Randy's neck tenderly. She sobbed into his soft brown fur. The man patted Harriet softly on the nose, smiling warmly at her. A small child, who could be no older than 8 or 9, ran over to Maggie excitedly. Maggie was ecstatic as she got her beautiful ebony feathers ruffled softly. As the woman was holding her baby, she said, "I can't let you go without a reward. Please stay in the village and rest here as long as you need. We have food, water, and a perfectly suitable stable for you to stay in." The village people cheered as the animals walked towards the stables. They had saved her. Jasmine was home. Randy and Harriet got settled on their big beds of straw. They barely ate before they fell asleep. Maggie rested on the roof, watching over her friends. they were finally sleeping. The end.